So I'm leaving instructions. Everything in every step of the process had a pre-work purpose. It's frustrating. And we know charters. And so we're always talking. It's going well.
So then in town, I have plans to go up north and
Not getting. And I think in the future, it's going to happen.
leaving on 9th, coming back on the 16th. It's kind of making some. I'm sorry. Sue the way that day.
All right, let's take it.
Moved down here. They were living in Washington, DC. But then they had-
Good morning.
I think Jim's introducing you this morning.
I
All right, which ear do you want that on?
can't.
Since you've got it in that-
Poorly in both ears.
Since you've got it in that pocket, let's put it over here.
Okay. And it's on already.
Bend this a little bit. Say something to me.
Good morning.
Jim, are you introducing this?
If you like.
I don't really. You know, they're unfortunate enough to already know me without reminding them that I'm here.
We'll just kind of call over. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're here today. Our teacher today is Lou Greer. And Lou, we are grateful for you leading us this morning. How about we begin with a word of prayer? Dear God, we thank you for the privilege of being together this morning to share in your word in creative ways. Lord, we pray that you would open our hearts and our minds to the words that you would have for us this morning. We pray for Lou as he leads us, that you would fill him with your spirit. And we ask these prayers in Jesus' name. Amen. Lou.
Thank you. Excuse me. Good morning. I need to start with a little bit of background. In 1954, I was a student at a prep school in Western Massachusetts. At this school, we were required to go to church regardless of our religious background, and we were required to go to Vespers every Sunday evening. And at these Vespers services, we sang hymns, usually very familiar ones, and almost always only one verse of each. The headmaster's favorite was "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," so we did that one almost every week. And my favorite was and remains "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," having been in the Coast Guard, which is attached to some of the Navy customs. And then there was a speaker. Very often the speaker came from outside the school. In fact, those of you who remember Tracy Sanders, her father, George Pera, many years after I graduated from there, was invited up to be the presenter at the Vesper service. And it was something he called me about 4 times during the week before, because this is a man who spoke, who preached at Westminster Abbey, and yet he was more nervous about going to Deerfield Academy than he was to going to London, England. Anyway, so one time in early June of 1954, one of my teachers, a man named Robert McGlynn, was asked to be the speaker. And he delivered something which absolutely excited me, which was very hard to do back then. And he delivered the piece that I'm going to share with you today. And because I expressed my interest in it, he gave me his carbon copy of it, and which I, as you can see, have kept ever since. And I read to myself quite often. And so this was in 1954. 25, first of all, it was then delivered every year afterwards because it was so impressive to the people who attended it. And 25 years later, the Deerfield Press published a hard copy of it, 600 copies only, and 100 of them went to Ireland, where Mr. McGlynn came from, and 100 of them, 500 of them remained in the country, in the U.S. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get one of those copies. So I am going to use my copy because it's more legible to me than the fuzzy carbon copy, and deliver it pretty much as Mr. McGlynn did to me in 1954. I don't claim to be nearly as good with the words as Mr. McGlynn was, but he started by saying, "I'd like to tell you a story. I shouldn't want to take out an oath that every last detail is true. And yet I think you'll know that neither is it altogether fictitious. I met him first during my 17th year when I was studying abroad in the famous old city of, well, for the sake of anonymity and my own checkered past, suppose we go to Thackeray and call it by the fictitious name of Vanity Fair. My quarters were very modest because I hadn't yet earned the means to pay my way in life. They were located close to the sky in a cramped garret over his odd little antique and novelty shop at number 10 Trial Street. My room was all but bare of appointments, but at least I had a dormer window with a big seat underneath it, and where I could sit at night when sleep seemed a waste of time and look at the stars. So close sometimes that it seemed that I only had to reach out my hand to gain hold of one. Now, more than once, though I feel a little foolish saying it now, more than once, as a matter of fact, being only 17 and not very wise, I did make a try for one, only to miss by a millennium or two. And in the daytime, taking leave of my studies now and again, I would sometimes sit there and gaze down at the people passing by. Trial Street had very few commercial establishments, but oddly enough, I noticed a great many people pass by. Some hurried as if they were already too late. Others walked tentatively in a way to make one think that possibly they'd come there by mischance and had no heart for it. Still others merely drifted, as people will who have become indifferent to a way grown too familiar. And there were those who seemed almost furtive, as if for some past misconduct which made them doubtful of being seen on Trial Street. One and all, though, they had ordinary faces, like the faces you might see on your own street. And I expect that now, good many years later, some of them are still passing down Trial Street, but that others have given up altogether going that way. He, as I said, was the proprietor of a little antique and novelty shop that occupied the ground floor of the building. He was curious looking, scarcely bigger than the shadow of a doubt. And to judge from the myriad wrinkles on his face, very old indeed. During the early weeks of our acquaintance, I was inclined to laugh at him to myself. His personality was so unobtrusive that one might walk into his cluttered shop and be there for 5 minutes before you even noticed he was there. How could anyone so unprepossessing hope to succeed in business? Well, he was kind to me, and rather unlike most of the grown people I knew who were really wanting to advise me at all the time. So in time, I found myself coming down to talk with him frequently. I had wonderful plans and ambitions and needed someone in whom I could confide them. One day I would tell him, I want to be rich and a distinguished personality with a city home sumptuous with servants and a place in the country, possibly with extensive hunting preserves and ample quarters for many guests. And I wanted to be famous too, so that people would point me out in the street, and that really important and distinguished people would seek out my acquaintance. He seldom said anything about these ambitions of mine. He simply nodded or smiled or looked grave or looked like he knew. One day I asked him, had he always been here? He said, oh no, he said, though it has been some time now. Well, where were you before? I asked. He didn't say anything for a moment. And then he said, everywhere. Well, I judged he was probably too old to remember exactly, or that he chose not to say, so I dropped the subject. Although obviously he couldn't have been everywhere. Curious as was the old fellow who ran it, the shop was uncommonly ordinary. In the front part, behind a meticulously polished bow window, were his novelties, which made up quite the largest part of his trade. While far at the back of the shop, displayed tidily, but in no great abundance, were his antiques. They, I am afraid, went very badly indeed. Apparently, most of his customers were not particularly interested in antiques. And then, too, for so small and unglamorous a shop, they were priced, it seemed to me, extremely high. Just for example, arranged on an upper shelf were 3 quite firm convictions for sale. They were in excellent state of preservation, like all his antiques, as if to proclaim they had never been subjected to much use. Yet one day when a customer asked the price of one, he wanted 100 indecisions for it. Well, obviously she didn't care to part with that much for something so out of fashion. But as she withdrew, he said, "Well, madam, if you'd like, I do have a few up front among the novelties that aren't quite so firm." And so it ended up with her buying one of those, which he told her quite honestly, might not last, but at least didn't cost so much. The firm convictions were only one item. As I recall, there were some racks near the ceiling, from which fell several bolts of rather pleasant memories. Slightly faded, to be sure, but hand-woven in intricately delicate designs. These too were expensive to come by, but I once heard him tell a prospective buyer they could be got on time. Then, in one corner, there were 2 barrels full of really good deeds. Every so often, he did manage to get rid of 1 or 2 of those. But I expect that was because they weren't terribly expensive. The bigger ones sold for a slight inconvenience, while the smaller ones could be got for an impulse apiece. The customers were every conceivable sort, old and young, some eager, some casual, to the point of indifference. Only one do I remember at all well, and that's because he came in every single week almost for a whole year. And he always seemed particularly urgent. Each time he bought 2 brand new chances up front among the novelties, and he paid a pound of faith a piece for them. They were among the best-selling items in the shop, and eventually proprietor ran out of them and couldn't procure any more. So thereafter, the urgent fellow never came in again. I did see him once or twice afterwards on Trial Street, looking shoddy and dissolute and down in the heel. To look at him, you would have sworn he didn't have a pound of faith left to his name. Of all the antiques in the shop, though, the prize was what the proprietor called a world of happiness. It was a large, fantastically executed globe, which you only had to flick with your finger to send into seemingly perpetual motion. Spinning, it gave off a wonderful, merry sort of melody and a whole procession of twinkling images and lavishly colored pictures. He would never let me or anyone else for that matter touch it. But one day he himself flicked it for me. It's impossible to describe the effect. The whole interior of the shop grew dazzling. And although I must have been tired from too much studying, I only imagined it. I could have sworn I heard birds singing and the low murmur of a gentle wind in the tall grasses and the sound of water trickling in a gay and merry stream and the voice of young people laughing and the heavier voices of older people laughing too. I felt all over a fire. And just as I was beginning to be quite ridiculously carried away, he stopped it. I asked him how much it was. He seemed oddly reluctant to say, and he hesitated, but I persisted. And so finally, almost apologetically, I thought, to buy this, you must pay all your worldly ambitions, all the things you've told me you most want in life. I looked at him incredulously. The old fellow was clearly at the end of his wits. Imagine giving up so much simply for a spinning novelty. Stupid bargain. I could tell you more about the old fellow and his shop, but I expect you've heard enough by now, and it really isn't a very exciting story. And probably I've been dull to think it would be of any interest to you. But I did have a reason for telling it to you. You see, shortly after the day that he showed me his world of happiness, the old fellow came to me and said that he was closing up and moving away. He seemed rather sad, as I recall, but I can only remember being annoyed at having to gather my few belongings and find new quarters. But move away he did. And from that day to this, I've never heard of him. Sometimes, oddly enough, when I wander in a strange city, I find myself looking out for his shop and hoping to see him again. And I told you this story so that if any of you ever happen on it and recognize it from my description and go inside and see the world of happiness, and don't think you yourself care to invest so heavily just for a spinning globe, you might send the address to me. You see, now I'm willing to pay. And that is the story of 10 Trial Street, which has stayed with me ever since 1954. And my children would tell you I read it ad nauseum because it meant a lot to me then, and it means a lot to me now. And funny thing is, I took it to one of my major reunions, and I read it to the group, and it suddenly disappeared. Someone else hadn't heard it before and took it home. And without me saying anything to anyone, another copy of it showed up at my house about 2 weeks later. Someone did recognize what it meant to me, and it still does. And in fact, my father even took the carbon copy and read it, which surprised me tremendously because he didn't think I was one of the great intellects of the family. So anyway, that was my time. I don't know if anyone down here has even heard of Deerfield Academy, but it meant a lot to me. And this probably was the most impressive thing that I recall there. So if I can handle any question you have or comments you have. Where it's located in Deerfield, Massachusetts, which is close to Northampton, where Smith College is, and not too far away from Springfield, which of course is a larger one. But it's a small little colonial town where a lot of what happened in the Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War happened in that vicinity. And it's it's interesting that I go there as often as I can at reunions because they hold an incredibly good clam bake at every one of these. And I took my two oldest sons, who you may have met a few weeks ago when they were here, and Mr. McGlynn sat down with them and taught them how to eat a lobster, as only Bob McGlynn can do. And it's something that has stayed with the kids, and they teach their children how to eat lobster the way he did. So, but anyway, I sometimes tell the story. In 1951, I was at a Columbia University football game. My father went to Columbia, and before he was president of the United States, General Eisenhower was president of Columbia. And this was a Columbia Army football game. And during halftime, the general held a session for the big givers, not for the youngsters like me. And I stood outside the ropes just to see the great general. And in the middle of his time there, he ran out of ink and his fountain pen. And he said out loud to his people, "Does someone have a pen I can use?" And hearing that, I yelled, "I do." And he came over, and my pen was from Deerfield. It was a Deerfield pen. And he took it and looked at it. He said, "Oh, please give Dr. Boyden my best regards. he knew our headmaster. And my mother, because my parents knew that I lost almost anything of any importance to me. So to the day that she died, my mother did not believe that General Eisenhower had my pen. And she said it to me a lot more than once. Anyway, did he keep it? I never got it back. Now, what I'd like to say is that it's in the Eisenhower Library, but I don't really think it is. But well, Mr. McGlynn wrote it, and he delivered it at this Vesper service. Admittedly, it was a week after school closed for those of us who academically needed a little help. And we liked it so much that apparently thereafter, it was always a mainstay of a Vesper service every year. And 25 years later is when the hard copy was printed and sold out immediately. Although he was very Irish, and 100 of the 600 copies went to Ireland. I have no idea where, but Mr. McGlynn was the author of it. And if you had known him, it would not have surprised you. He's quite a man.
What was his academic area?
He taught English, but he also was a dormitory leader and happened to be the leader of my dormitory. And I like to think that he liked me, but I doubt it. Because I was not one of his great scholars.
The story is very profound.
Isn't it? As I say, I've read it for all these years. I read it to myself several times every year because it means so much to me, and it meant so much to me that time too. Yeah.
Shared it with the past, and just today, as I'm hearing you talk about it, this balance between ambition and happiness, and how too much ambition can steal happiness. And I'm also making me think about, and I won't preach my sermon in advance here, but we are going. Interesting how often Sunday school classes tie in with upcoming service. But I'm preaching on Jesus saying, "I will give you rest," and I'm playing with this balance of work and rest. You know, and a lot of times our ambition is about our sense of purpose in life and what we want to accomplish through our work, right? And yet there's also the importance of not getting so wrapped up in that, wrapped up in accomplishment, wrapped up in making our place in the world or whatever, that we lose touch with what really makes life good. And I just love the way this story plays with that concept of work and rest. And like the guy studying his studies, I mean, he's got to go make a living somehow, right? He's got to study and be ready to be in the world.
Yeah.
Yet finding a way to not be so wrapped up in those ambitions, still find what makes you happy. It's a life challenge for it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Mike, because my older brother and I are about as different in how we brought ourselves up as could be. The dean of the Harvard Business School said he was one of the finest students that had ever been there. And I I didn't measure up to that, but the dean at my college called me and said that I realized that the only A's I had ever received were on black sweaters, which was because I played 4 sports at a college that did not pride itself on its athletes. And, but the funny thing is that dean and I were good friends to the day he died. And I wonder how many of the great students he even remembered. I just don't know, but and yes, his daughter moved to Greenville and showed up at an event I ran for Amherst. And I had known her when she was about this size. And it was quite something to get reintroduced to her after all that time.
Well, Lou, you're very humble, but I also know that one of the things that you have been involved with here is lacrosse, and that you have pursued the things that make you happy in a way that it benefits other people. So, like the lacrosse, there was a tournament that you were very involved with here. Right?
Yeah, lacrosse was my favorite of the sports I played. And when I came here to Greenville, somehow the superintendent of schools, who is now in Pennsylvania, heard that I had played lacrosse and he wanted to start it here in Greenville. So he called me and asked if I would do it. And I did. I recruited referees, trained the referees, and we started it, I think, in about 10 schools, and now it's all over the state. And then in the middle of all this, I went and recruited a national collegiate lacrosse tournament. They had previously been in Dallas and Los Angeles, I believe. And suddenly, much to the surprise of most of their schools, they ended up in Greenville, South Carolina. And I must say it was an interesting time because they stayed here for 3 years and then got out as fast as they could. Although the parents, and a lot of the parents came, the parents loved it here. You know, the schools really wanted a bigger venue. And so, yeah, we were very involved with getting lacrosse into the area. And I'm very glad of that, and a lot of the former lacrosse players here are still friends of mine, you know, much younger than I am, but so anyway, it was yeah, I guess.
A's on your black sweater, but you do have A's in life and with people.
Thank you. If my father is looking down, I hope he's listening. Yes.
I wanted to add, it just seems like a story that I can tell gets better for you and any reader as the years go on. It just becomes more and more meaningful.
Mm.
So I'm sure that's why you have connected with it so deeply and read it to yourself so many times, because it's a great subliminal reminder to ourselves of what ought to be important. Great spirit. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you see that in it, because that's what I see in it as well.
I feel like I was first started reading, I was taking it as kind of a literal antique shop, you know, and it took me a minute until he was selling the first, I don't remember what it was, and it cost like a different, I don't know, whatever the circumstance.
Well, I'd be very happy to have you take it with you, and you can return it to the church when.
Some of my students that aren't best learners at their age is helping them understand that they don't have to be great at this to be great in life. And I feel like that is such a valuable piece of writing. They wouldn't understand it at the age that they're at when I teach them, but I feel like that is a value to instill in all children. Just because this is not your avenue, just because this is not your greatest strength, doesn't mean you don't have a bright future.
I agree, but I agree out of necessity as much as anything else. You know, I sort of underplay myself. I don't think I'm quite as stupid as but close.
Doing what makes you happy and finding a way to do that and share that with other people. You can, meaningful work and significant work is available to people regardless of where you may, what grade you may get in school or whatever, but if you find out where your passions are, then there's some meaningful work to be done.
It was interesting that I taught Sunday school in Connecticut. And in fact, I was superintendent of the Sunday school, which surprised me as much as anybody, I'm sure. But I think that was the tone of how I taught, and I think that a lot of the youngsters accepted that or liked that, because I remember Dr. Pera, our pastor, coming to me or calling me and saying that the head of Christian education had called him and complained about me again. And but Pera's son was in my class, and he finished our conversation, said, "I'm not sure what you're doing, but David knows his Bible, so whatever it is, keep doing it." and
Dr. Aaron, did you mention that earlier? He praised Sanders.
yeah, I positioned him as Tracy Sanders' father, who was a very dear friend. In fact, he called me. His wife called me from England and said, "Was I going to be in London soon?" Yeah, right. And I said, "I can be." And he said, "Well, I really want you to talk to Tracy." So, which was very interesting. And Tracy and I had a very interesting time. I did go over. And so George and Nancy and I lived in the Cascades till my wife passed away. And George and Nancy ended up living in the Cascades until she passed away. And so anyway, he became an important part of my life, not quite as important as this church has become to me. As anyway.
Thank you for being here today. I wanted to close on time here. Just mention that we do have another opening for those of you who have been realizing, oh, you missed your opportunity to tell a story to teach a class. August the 6th has become available. So a couple weeks ago yet, and if you've been sitting back thinking, wow, this is an opportunity on the spot. So you have a chance to do that. So August the 6th, right, Jim?
That's the date, and we're very open to any format you would like, whether it's a formal presentation or something very, something like Lou did, where you share something that's important.
Conversational, music, PowerPoint. Was that juggling? All right, you're over here. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, I knew he lived over near, Mark and Julia Sibley. Yeah. I didn't know where he lived.
Howell, thank you. Some great sense.